copper was still warm when she left the house. The laundry boiler in the scullery at the back of 2 Vine Cottages, Park Road, Richmond, had been burning since before midnight, and it was now approaching 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday the 3rd of March, 1879. The woman who had lit the fire beneath it 7 hours earlier walked out the front door, turned left onto Park Road, and made her way through the dark streets of Richmond toward the Hole in the Wall, a public house less than a quarter-mile away, where she intended to have a drink while she waited for the contents of the copper to finish rendering. The contents of the copper were the remains of her employer. Her name was Kate Webster. She was 30 years old. She had been born Catherine Lawler in Killan, near Enniscorthy, in County Wexford, Ireland, in 1849, and she had been a thief since she was old enough to understand that taking things that belonged to other people was easier than earning them. She had been imprisoned for larceny in Wexford at the age of 15. She had stolen her way to Liverpool on a ticket purchased with money that was not hers. She had been arrested and convicted in London more times than the records could easily track, using aliases that included Webb, Gibbs, Gibbons, and Lawler, rotating her names the way other women rotated their dresses, discarding each one the moment it became too closely associated with the consequences of her behavior. She had a son. His name was John. He had been born on the 18th of April, 1874, and he was 5 years old. She was not married, though she claimed to have been the wife of a sea captain named Webster, a man whose existence was never reliably confirmed, and whose death, along with the deaths of 4 children she said she had borne him, rested entirely on Kate's word, which was a foundation that could not support the weight of a single, truthful sentence. She loved the boy. This was the one thing about Kate Webster that everyone who knew her agreed upon. She loved her son with a ferocity that stood in bewildering contrast to everything else she did, and she had placed him in the care of a woman named Sarah Creese, a charwoman who lived nearby, so that the boy would not have to share the small, suffocating rooms of the various lodging houses and servants' quarters that Kate moved through like a current of dirty water, finding its level. She had been employed by Julia Martha Thomas for approximately 7 weeks. Thomas was a retired schoolteacher, about 54 years old according to her own doctor, twice widowed, childless, and living alone in a neat 2-story semi-detached villa at the edge of Richmond, a quiet, respectable suburb of London, where the gardens were trimmed and the curtains were drawn at the proper hour, and the neighbors noticed everything but said nothing, unless the thing they noticed could no longer be politely ignored. Thomas was particular about her house. She was particular about her routine. She was particular about the standard of work she expected from the woman she had hired to clean it, and she had made her displeasure with Kate's performance known within the first fortnight. The nature of their disputes, as neighbors later described them to the police and the press, followed a pattern that would have been familiar to any household in Richmond where a demanding mistress employed a resentful maid. The exchanges went something like this. "You have not cleaned behind the dresser," Thomas said on one of those early mornings, standing in the parlor with her arms folded, her voice carrying the precise, clipped tone of a woman who had spent decades in a classroom, and who regarded every person in her household as a student who had not yet met her expectations. "I cleaned where I was told to clean, ma'am," Kate replied. "You were told to clean the parlor. The parlor includes the space behind the dresser. If I must explain to you what the word parlor means, then I have hired the wrong person." Kate said nothing. She picked up her cloth, she moved the dresser, she cleaned behind it, and she filed the conversation in the place inside her where she kept every slight and every instruction and every raised eyebrow and every pursed lip, and the file grew thicker with each passing day until it was less a record than a weapon, loaded and waiting for the moment when she would decide to use it. Thomas gave her notice on the 28th of February. 7 weeks of employment, and it was over. Kate asked if the notice period could be extended to the 2nd of March, a Sunday. Thomas agreed. The extension was granted for reasons that were never explained, and that would, in retrospect, seem like the single worst decision Julia Martha Thomas ever made. On the morning of Sunday, the 2nd of March, Thomas went to church. She attended the morning service at her parish church in Richmond, as she did every Sunday, and she returned home briefly before going out again for the evening service. Kate, who was allowed Sunday afternoons off, visited her son at Sarah Crease's house and then stopped at the hole in the wall on the way back, arriving home later than she should have. Thomas was annoyed. She reprimanded Kate for her lateness, told her that this was precisely the kind of behavior that had led to her dismissal, and then left for the evening service in a state that several fellow parishioners later described as agitated. She told friends at church that she was afraid to be alone in the house with the woman. She asked no one to accompany her home. She left the service early. She walked home alone. She opened the front door of Two Vine Cottages and stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, and whatever happened next happened behind walls that were too thick for the neighbors to hear through, and too respectable for them to press their ears against. In the confession she would give, on the night before her execution, 5 months later, Kate described it this way. They quarreled. The quarrel became violent. In the height of her anger, she threw Thomas from the top of the stairs to the ground floor. Thomas fell heavily. She was seriously injured. Kate lost all control of herself. She caught Thomas by the throat. She choked her. Other accounts suggest she also struck Thomas with the flat side of an axe before pushing her down the stairs. The precise sequence was never fully reconciled, but the result was the same. Julia Martha Thomas, retired schoolteacher, twice widowed, about 54 years old, who had survived 2 husbands and a career in education, and the particular loneliness of a woman living alone in a house that was too large for one person but too respectable to leave, was dead at the bottom of her own staircase. What Kate Webster did next is the part of this story that Victorian England could not absorb, and that the passage of 146 years has not made any easier to comprehend. She did not panic. She did not flee. She did not call for help or attempt to construct a story or sit in the corner and weep. She stood over the body of the woman she had just killed, and she made a series of decisions that were so systematic, so practical, and so thoroughly devoid of any recognizable human emotion that the investigators who later reconstructed her actions struggled to describe them in language that did not sound like the operation of a machine. She dragged the body into the scullery. She retrieved a razor, a meat saw, and a carving knife from the kitchen. She removed the clothing from the corpse. And then, in the small back room of a respectable London villa on a Sunday night in March, she began to dismember Julia Martha Thomas. She cut the head from the body with the razor, using the saw and the knife to work through the bone and the tissue. She separated the limbs. She divided the torso into pieces small enough to fit inside the laundry copper, the large cast-iron boiler that sat in the scullery and that was used under ordinary circumstances to heat water for washing clothes. She filled the copper with water. She lit the fire beneath it. She placed the pieces of Julia Martha Thomas inside, one by one, and she set them to boil. The purpose of the boiling was not destruction, it was concealment. Kate understood that a body, if discovered intact, could be identified. A body that had been reduced to fat and bone could not. She intended to render the flesh from the bones, to reduce the recognizable human form of her employer into something that could not be traced back to a name or an address or a missing persons report. It was, in its way, a kind of terrible intelligence, the application of a practical mind to a problem that most human beings cannot even allow themselves to imagine. While the copper worked, Kate went to the pub. She walked to the hole in the wall, less than a quarter-mile from the house where the remains of her employer were dissolving in boiling water, and she ordered a drink, and she sat among the regular patrons of a Richmond public house on a Sunday night, and she gave no indication that anything unusual had occurred, or was occurring, or would continue to occur for the next several hours in the small house on Park Road where the fire beneath the copper was still burning and would burn until dawn. She returned to the house sometime after 2 in the morning. The boiling had done its work. The flesh had separated from the bones. A thick layer of fat had risen to the surface of the water. Kate skimmed it. She collected the fat into containers, and in the days that followed, according to testimony that was never conclusively proven, but that was widely believed and that horrified the nation when it was reported, she offered the rendered fat to neighbors and to local children as dripping and lard. The bones and the remaining tissue were packed into a wooden box that Kate found in the house. She worked quickly. She packed the pieces tightly, but the head and one foot would not fit. The foot she buried in a manure pile behind a neighboring property. The head she placed in a black bag, the kind that a woman might carry on an errand without attracting attention. She needed help with the box. It was heavy. She could not carry it alone. She went to the Porters, a family she had known years earlier when she lived in Hammersmith, and she arrived at their door wearing Julia Martha Thomas's silk dress. She introduced herself to them as Mrs. Thomas. She told them she had married since they last met, had a child, been widowed, and had been left a house in Richmond by an aunt. She invited Henry Porter and his son Robert to a pub, the Oxford and Cambridge Arms in Barnes, and along the way she disposed of the black bag, probably dropping it into the Thames while the Porters were inside the pub drinking. It was never recovered. She then asked young Robert Porter if he could help her carry a heavy box from 2 Vine Cottages to the station. Robert agreed. Together, they carried the box through the streets of Richmond in the dark, 2 people walking along a quiet road with a wooden box between them, and the neighbors who might have seen them from their windows would have seen nothing more remarkable than a woman and a young man carrying a delivery, which is exactly what it looked like. They reached Richmond Bridge. Kate told Robert that a friend was coming to collect the box. She sent him ahead. He walked away. He heard a splash behind him. When Kate caught up with him a few minutes later, she no longer had the box. The box floated. The Thames did not hold it beneath the surface. It drifted downstream. The next morning, fishermen spotted it. They pulled it from the water. They opened it. Boiled human remains. The police were summoned. An examination was conducted. The remains were determined to be those of a woman, but without a head, without teeth, without any identifying features. The investigation stalled. While the police struggled to connect the remains from the river to a name, Kate had already begun erasing the woman she had killed and replacing her. She moved freely through the house. She wore Thomas's clothes. She put on Thomas's rings. She introduced herself to new acquaintances as Mrs. Thomas, explaining that she was a widow who had recently inherited the property from a dear aunt. She began selling Thomas's furniture. She contacted a man named John Church, who dealt in second-hand goods, and negotiated the sale of the entire contents of the house. She discussed the possibility of selling the house itself. She was not hiding. She was not cowering. She was conducting business, wearing a dead woman's jewelry, sitting in a dead woman's chair, sleeping in a dead woman's bed, and carrying a dead woman's name as though it had always been hers. She also sold Thomas's gold bridgework. The false teeth were still attached. She received 6 shillings for it from a local pawnbroker who did not ask where it had come from, because pawnbrokers in 1879 did not ask questions whose answers might cost them a sale. For 2 weeks, the impersonation held. The neighbors did not question it. The tradesmen did not question it. The world outside 2 Vine Cottages continued as it always had, the gardens trimmed, the curtains drawn, the respectability of Park Road maintained by the collective agreement of its residents to see only what they expected to see, and to leave the rest undisturbed. The unraveling began on the 18th of March. Deliverymen arrived at the house to collect furniture that Webster had agreed to sell. A neighbor watched the transaction from across the street. The deliverymen pointed to the woman inside the house and said they were working for Mrs. Thomas. The neighbor looked at the woman. The woman was not Mrs. Thomas. The neighbor had known Julia Martha Thomas for years. The woman in the doorway was taller, younger, and carrying herself with a looseness that Thomas, with her stiff posture and her teacher's bearing, would never have permitted. The neighbor alerted the police. Officers arrived at 2 Vine Cottages. They searched the house. There were bloodstains in the scullery that had been partially cleaned but not removed. There were charred bone fragments in the kitchen grate. There was a thick, fatty residue behind the laundry boiler, the remnant of what had been rendered there on the night of the 2nd of March. The smell in the house, despite weeks of ventilation, had not entirely dissipated. It was the smell of rendered fat. It was the smell of a human body that had been cooked. Kate was gone. She had fled the moment the police arrived, moving with the speed and the instinct of a woman who had been running from consequences her entire life. She went to Ireland. She went home, to Killan, to her uncle's house near Enniscorthy, County Wexford, the place she had left as a teenager with stolen money in her pocket. She was arrested on the 29th of March, 1879. She was still wearing Julia Martha Thomas's dress. She was still wearing Julia Martha Thomas's rings. She had taken her son with her, the boy she loved more than anything, and she had carried him back to Ireland alongside the evidence of her crime, the dead woman's silk against her skin, and the dead woman's gold on her fingers. The journey from Enniscorthy to Dublin was conducted under police escort, and at nearly every station along the route, crowds gathered on the platform to stare at the woman the newspapers had already named the Richmond murderess. They jeered, they shouted, they pressed against the windows of the carriage. The case had crossed the Irish Sea before Kate had, and the public appetite for the details of what she had done was so intense that Madame Tussauds in London created a wax figure of Kate Webster and put it on display before the trial had even begun. The trial opened on the 2nd of July, 1879, at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, before Mr. Justice Denman. The prosecution was led by the Solicitor General, Sir Harding Giffard, a measure of the case's extraordinary significance. On the 4th day of proceedings, the future King of Sweden, Crown Prince Gustav, took a seat in the public gallery. The streets outside were crowded with people who could not get in, and who stood in the summer heat waiting for reports to emerge from the courtroom doors. Kate denied everything. She pointed at John Church, the man who had tried to buy Thomas's furniture, and shouted across the courtroom, "Here is your murderer." Church was briefly arrested, then released when his alibi proved unshakable. Kate then attempted to shift the blame to Robert Porter's father, Henry. This, too, was proven false. She then claimed that a man named Strong, the father of her child, had been responsible. This was equally baseless. Each accusation she made collapsed under the weight of the evidence assembled against her, and the evidence was extensive and methodical and utterly damning. The bloodstains, the bone fragments, the fatty residue, the boiled remains in the Thames, the gold bridgework sold to the pawnbroker, the furniture sold to dealers, the clothing worn by the wrong woman, the rings on the wrong fingers, the neighbors who had seen a woman who was not Mrs. Thomas pretending to be Mrs. Thomas. The trial lasted 6 days. Kate showed almost no emotion throughout the proceedings. She sat in the dock with a composure that the press described as stolid and calm, an observation that troubled the Victorian public far more than tears would have. A properly feminine woman, by the standards of the age, should have been penitent, weeping, overcome by the horror of what she had done. Kate was none of these things. She watched the witnesses testify against her with the detached attention of a woman observing a performance that did not involve her. She cried only once. It was when her son was mentioned. The boy's name entered the courtroom, and something behind Kate's face moved, something that the mask she had been wearing for 6 days could not contain, and for a moment the woman who had boiled her employer's body and sold the fat and worn the dead woman's clothes and lied to every person she had spoken to for 5 months, showed the only genuine emotion that anyone in that courtroom would ever see from her. It was grief. It was not grief for Julia Martha Thomas. It was grief for the boy she was about to leave behind. On the final day, with the evidence against her overwhelming and the verdict all but certain, Kate played her last card. She announced to the court that she was pregnant. Under English law at the time, a pregnant woman could not be executed. The announcement sent a ripple through the courtroom. The judge ordered the assembly of a jury of matrons, 12 women selected from among those present in the courthouse, to examine the defendant and determine whether her claim was true. The courtroom fell silent. Kate was taken to a side room. The 12 women followed. The barristers stood at their tables. The spectators in the gallery leaned forward. The Crown Prince of Sweden watched from his seat. The minutes passed. The silence in the courtroom was the particular silence that fills a room when the next word spoken will decide whether a person lives or dies, and everyone present understood that the examination taking place behind the closed door was not a medical procedure but a final performance. A last attempt by a woman who had lied about everything else to lie her way past the gallows. The matrons returned. They entered the courtroom and took their places. The foreman of the jury of matrons stood. She was not pregnant. Kate's face did not change. Whatever she had hoped for, whatever she had calculated, whatever small flame of possibility she had been holding inside her chest for the duration of the examination, it went out without a visible trace. She received the verdict of guilty and the sentence of death with the same composure she had maintained throughout the trial, the composure of a woman who had understood for a long time that the world was a place where the things you took from other people could be taken from you in return, and that the only question was when. On the night of the 28th of July, 1879, the night before her execution, Kate asked to speak to a priest. Father McHenry came to her cell. She confessed. She described the murder, the dismemberment, the boiling, the disposal. She said she was resigned to her fate, and that she would almost rather be executed than return to a life of misery and deception. She described the quarrel on the stairs and the moment she caught Thomas by the throat, and the hours that followed in the scullery with the razor and the saw and the knife and the fire beneath the copper. She described it all with the calm, detailed precision of a woman who had kept the account inside her for 5 months, and who was now, with 12 hours left to live, setting it down. She was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the morning of the 29th of July, 1879. The executioner drew the cap over her face, stepped back, and released the trapdoor. Kate Webster was the second person executed at Wandsworth and the only woman ever hanged there. Of the 135 people who would eventually be executed at the prison over the following 82 years, she was the only one whose grave was never reused. 134 men were buried, and, when space ran out, their graves were opened and shared. Kate's grave was left alone. No one was placed on top of her. The prison let her lie by herself, in the ground, in the dark, forever. What became of her son, the boy named John, the child she had loved with a ferocity that stood apart from everything else she did, the boy whose name was the only thing that made her cry in 6 days of testimony, the records do not say. He was 5 years old when his mother was hanged. He had been in the care of Sarah Creese. Whether Creese continued to raise him, whether he was sent to a workhouse, whether he grew up knowing what his mother had done, or was shielded from it by people who believed that some truths are too heavy for a child to carry, the silence of the archive offers no answer. He was born. He was loved. In the only way that Kate Webster was capable of loving. And then he was left behind, and the world moved on without recording what happened to him. Julia Martha Thomas was buried in Barnes Cemetery. Her body, or what remained of it after the Thames gave back the box and the police recovered the foot from the manure pile, was interred without the one piece that Kate had taken and never returned. The head was missing. It had been missing since the night of the 2nd of March. Kate had carried it out of the house in a black bag. She had gone somewhere with it. She had come back without it. And in 5 months of questioning, in 6 days of trial, in the final confession on the night before the rope, she never said where she had put it. 131 years passed. The house on Park Road changed hands. The hole-in-the-wall pub, where Kate had drunk while her employer's body boiled, continued to operate for more than a century before closing around 2007. Shortly after, a man bought the vacant pub and the land around it. His name was Sir David Attenborough. He was one of the most famous naturalists in the world. He had lived in the house next door since 1952. He intended to build an extension on the land where the pub had stood. In October of 2010, builders excavating the site for the foundation of the extension struck something in the earth. It was round. It was dark. It was buried beneath a layer of Victorian-era tiles, as though someone had placed it there deliberately, beneath a surface that would not be disturbed, in the ground behind a pub where a woman had once sat with a drink in her hand, and a secret in a black bag at her feet. It was a human skull. It was missing its teeth. It bore fracture marks consistent with a fall down a flight of stairs, and it had low collagen levels, consistent with having been boiled. Carbon dating placed it between 1650 and 1880. The Victorian tiles placed it at the end of that range. The location placed it within 100 yards of the house where Julia Martha Thomas had lived and died. The fractures placed it at the bottom of a staircase. The collagen placed it in a copper full of boiling water. And the absence of teeth placed it in the mouth of a woman whose gold bridgework had been pried out and sold for 6 shillings by a maid who needed a drink. In July of 2011, the coroner confirmed what everyone had suspected. It was Julia Martha Thomas. 131 years after her death, her head had been found, buried in the earth behind the pub where her killer had sat and waited for the flesh to separate from the bone. No family could be traced. Julia Martha Thomas had died childless, and the passage of more than a century had erased whatever connections she had once maintained with the living. Her skull was given a burial at last. The coroner recorded a verdict of unlawful killing. The cause of death was given as asphyxiation and a head injury. Kate Webster had kept the secret. Through the trial, through the confession, through the final hours before the rope. She had told the priest how she killed Thomas. She had told him how she cut the body apart. She had told him how she boiled the remains and sold the fat and packed the box and threw it from the bridge. But she had not told him where she put the head. She had carried that one detail to the gallows and through the trapdoor and into the grave that the prison never shared with anyone else, and it had stayed there in the silence for 131 years, until a naturalist bought a pub and a builder's shovel found what a killer's silence had hidden. A maid killed her mistress in a small house in Richmond on a Sunday night in March. She boiled the body. She wore the dead woman's clothes. She sold the dead woman's teeth. She lived the dead woman's life for 2 weeks in the dead woman's house, and no one noticed because the curtains were drawn and the garden was trimmed, and the respectability of Park Road could absorb almost anything as long as it happened behind closed doors. And then a box floated to the surface of the Thames, and the neighbors began to look more closely, and the woman who had been wearing Mrs. Thomas's rings turned out to be the woman who had put Mrs. Thomas in the river, and the head that could have proved it. All was buried in the ground behind a pub, and would not be found for more than a century. Some crimes are remembered for their violence. This one is remembered for something worse. The calm, the patience, the methodical, unhurried, terrifyingly practical way that one woman erased another from existence, and then stepped into the space she had created and lived there, wearing the dead woman's name, until the world finally looked close enough to see that the person standing in the doorway was not who she claimed to be. If this story is still crawling beneath your skin, if you cannot stop thinking about the copper in the scullery and the black bag and the skull in the garden, then I need to hear from you. Kate Webster confessed to everything except where she put the head. For 131 years, it lay buried behind a pub, less than a quarter mile from the house where the murder happened. She could have told them. She chose not to. Why? What was the head to her? Why was it the one thing she refused to give back? And what do you think happened to her son, the boy named John, the only person in the world who made a killer cry? Tell me in the comments. And if this story deserves to be heard by more people, if Julia Martha Thomas deserves to be remembered as more than a line in a coroner's report, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you are here when the next name rises from the silence. I will see you in the next one.